I had been raised in the mountains of Idaho by a father who distrusted many of the institutions that people take for granted: public education, doctors and hospitals, and the government. Every job I take, within minutes I'm thinking, I can't do this. I think it's what makes me work. People think I just swagger in and do it. But I doubt myself all the time. It's what pushes me, what makes me work harder. The older I get, the less I take for granted. Today, many people take for granted the notion that people whose lives are going to be very heavily affected by public policies should have a say in how they are formulated and carried out. It's an honor to be selected to the All-Star game. It's not something I take for granted. Communication is something we all take for granted. Having lived through the transition from totalitarianism, I am acutely mindful of the need to never take for granted the basic freedoms of thought, expression and belief that democracy brings. As is the case with many Middle Eastern nations, women are nowhere near equal to men when it comes to basic freedoms and rights that we take for granted every day. There are too many countries where the values we take for granted in our civil servants simply do not exist. Seeing these values in action, applied with dedication by hardworking individuals, makes me proud to lead a service that is making life better for millions across Britain. The most interesting lessons often lie in the mundane, those aspects of everyday life that locals take for granted and tourists tend to overlook. The 1890s was a decade when life began to change in urban America. Modern conveniences that we now take for granted came into use, women's roles became less restrictive, and San Francisco, a port city with influences from all over the world, was a lively place in which to reside. Today, as we look back on the history of our nation and take note of how far we have come as a people, we are reminded that we owe a great debt to those who fought valiantly for the freedoms that we easily take for granted. Looking at America's history, ordinary people did something extraordinary. Leaders risked their lives for freedoms that we take for granted today. That's what instills confidence. That's us. We will move forward and prosper because that's who we are as Americans. It's not a bad idea to occasionally spend a little time thinking about things you take for granted. Plain everyday things. I think we really feel like CrowdRise could be something that, 20 years from now, people take for granted because that's just how you do it, like if you're going to raise money for something, that's how you do it. That's an interesting question. I would say that in general Americans know very little about the law. It's one of those things that most of us take for granted. We take for granted electricity, water, even concerts. Count your blessings. You never can take for granted that you have a job. I think I've begun to take for granted how easily information can swirl around me. Often the magical elements in my books are standing in for elements of the real world, the small and magical in their own right sorts of things that we take for granted and no longer pay attention to, like the bonds of friendship that entwine our own lives with those of other people and places. We cannot forget the little things we take for granted in America that remain the disdain of dictators and terrorists throughout the world. Everybody gets everything handed to them. The rich inherit it. I don't mean just inheritance of money. I mean what people take for granted among the middle and upper classes, which is nepotism, the old boy network. You can take for granted that people know more or less what a street, a shop, a beach, a sky, an oak tree look like. Tell them what makes this one different. As a modern woman, there are things I take for granted, and that shows up in the way I sit, the way I walk, the way I think, and what I know to be possible. There is so much that people take for granted. Americans, like many citizens of rich countries, take for granted the legal and regulatory system, the public schools, health care and social security for the elderly, roads, defense and diplomacy, and heavy investments by the state in research, particularly in medicine. Whenever I get frustrated, I tell myself, you could be working at a 7-Eleven right now, so never take for granted what you do for a living. How quickly we forget God's great deliverances in our lives. How easily we take for granted the miracles He performed in our past. It was the labor movement that helped secure so much of what we take for granted today. The 40-hour work week, the minimum wage, family leave, health insurance, Social Security, Medicare, retirement plans. The cornerstones of the middle-class security all bear the Union label. Life is a precious gift, a gift we often take for granted until it is threatened. I have always had this view about the modern education system: we pay attention to brain development, but the development of warm-heartedness we take for granted. Including women in climate policy and solutions can enhance the results, leading to more economic growth and sustainable outcomes. However, we cannot take for granted that gender equality and women's empowerment in the field of climate change and sustainable development will happen automatically. I never take for granted how lucky I am to be an American and what a privilege it is to spend each day at a nonprofit dedicated to helping the next generation of girls achieve their dreams. My journey, as the daughter of refugees, shows what refugees and the children of refugees can create for all Americans. I would not take for granted that my personal life, because I knew better than anybody, that it was just a life. It was surprisingly an ordinary life. Let us not forget that the European community started as a project for peace after the terrible Second World War. And today people take for granted the freedom to travel, to study, to work abroad. And the citizens of one country have almost exactly the same rights as another country. And I highly recommend for all the women in the world, even if they're 71, you can never take for granted that he loves you. It's always good to flirt with him. It's a great sport. In 2004, the iPod was a novelty, and tablet computers were a dream. Now we take for granted that we can see whatever we want whenever and wherever we want to see it, be it Grand Illusion or Duck Dynasty. Freedom does not come without a price. We may sometimes take for granted the many liberties we enjoy in America, but they have all been earned through the ultimate sacrifice paid by so many of the members of our armed forces. Clean water and access to food are some of the simplest things that we can take for granted each and every day. In places like Africa, these can be some of the hardest resources to attain if you live in a rural area. Awareness requires a rupture with the world we take for granted, then old categories of experience are called into question and revised. I take pride in a lot of things people take for granted, so when opportunities come my way, I just cherish them and try to make the most of them. Read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, but to weigh and consider. I'm a lucky guy. I don't take for granted, for 1 minute, what I do. Creativity is an energy. It's a precious energy, and it's something to be protected. A lot of people take for granted that they're a creative person, but I know from experience, feeling it in myself, it is a magic, it is an energy, and it can't be taken for granted. End-of-the-world stories tend to ring true. I've always been drawn to them, but as I wrote my own, I found surprising pleasure in creating a world that is so radically changed, yet where there's so much meaning and value in every small and ordinary thing we have, and take for granted: hot showers, enough food, friends, routines. What most experimenters take for granted before they begin their experiments is infinitely more interesting than any results to which their experiments lead. We often take for granted that our lights will come on when we flip the light switch, but the reality is that our reliability standards and the current state of the transmission grid leave us all vulnerable to blackouts. I think humans is more about provoking the idea that there is a class of beings in society that we treat as less than, as subordinates, people who we treat badly and take for granted. Often they are the same people who work hard to keep the city going. We need to think about that. Earth as an ecosystem stands out in the all of the universe. There's no place that we know about that can support life as we know it, not even our sister planet, Mars, where we might set up housekeeping someday. But at great effort and trouble we have to recreate the things we take for granted here. Firstly, people take for granted that the EU has created the biggest economic space in the world. We all think there's greener things on the other side. We all take for granted what we have. I don't care who we are. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.